Do Chinese people really hate Japan?
第一个其实想问你有没有特别不喜欢的国家？日本，能就是解释一下为什么吗？
Let's get straight to the point. The answer to this question is yes. When it comes to the country of Japan, most Chinese people do have negative feelings. Of course, there are many Chinese people, and their attitudes towards Japan vary depending on their age group. Younger people, for example, generally don't have such a bad attitude towards Japan. However, looking at the entire population of China, the majority hold a negative view of Japan. It goes without saying that the main reason for this attitude comes from the harm caused by Japan to China during World War II, accounting for about 70%. The remaining 30% is due to Japan's position as an adversary in current international relations with China. This year, 2 incidents of Japanese people being attacked in China occurred. In June, a Japanese mother and child in Suzhou were attacked with a knife, and a Chinese woman tragically lost her life while protecting them. In September, another Japanese child was stabbed to death in Shenzhen. The motives of the attacker have not been made public, but it is clear that the attack was driven by a deep hatred for the Japanese. The occurrence of 2 attacks on Japanese individuals in such a short time frame is certainly not a pure coincidence. Behind these incidents, online nationalism is indeed playing a role. Everyone knows that today's internet platforms recommend related content based on your preferences, and Chinese internet companies are especially good at this kind of algorithm. But there's an obvious downside to this. It's easy to fall into an information bubble. You can hardly see content that disagrees with your views. The content you see and even the people you interact with keep reinforcing your perceptions on certain issues. For example, if I'm against political correctness, then on X, I'll only see posts mocking political correctness. And the commenters are naturally people who share my views. So I decisively started following some opposing accounts. Haha. Maybe you really don't agree with their views, but you need to understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. Don't just oppose everything without even listening to what others have to say. The 2 perpetrators are the same. On Chinese internet platforms, there are many people with extreme hatred towards Japan. I've seen related videos and visited their online communities. In their discussions, calls for Japan to pay with blood, attacking the Japanese mainland, and even launching more nuclear bombs to wipe out Japan are very common. They often bring up the horrific things Japan did in China during World War II, repeating them over and over again. Therefore, it's not surprising that a few irrational people resort to attacking Japanese individuals in real life. But when you step away from the internet and return to reality, you'll realize that this kind of thinking is actually very extreme. And in reality, people who harbor such intense hatred for Japan are actually quite few. Perhaps out of 100 people, there might not even be one. But you have to understand that with over 1 billion internet users in China, even if only 1 in 1,000 holds such views, that still amounts to over 1 million people. The internet has a powerful clustering effect, which makes it easy for them to develop a misconception that there are many people who think like them, perhaps even the majority. As a result, they start believing their views are justified and correct. There's a joke that perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. A single guy spends his days online, constantly encountering content about hating relationships, rejecting marriage, and refusing to have kids. Over time, he starts to believe that single people like him are the majority among young people. But then, when he attends a college reunion, he realizes he's the only one still single. Let's circle back to the original question. Overall, Chinese people hold a negative attitude toward Japan. In a way, this has almost become a form of political correctness in China. However, the majority of people don't actually dislike Japan. And in fact, when interacting with Japanese individuals, there's often quite a bit of goodwill. On the more extreme side, there's a group of people who are deeply enamored with Japan. Online, they're jokingly referred to as Dinger, Jingri, meaning spiritual Japanese. Just how over the top can this group be? Wearing kimonos out in public is just standard practice for them. Some even go as far as dressing up in World War II Japanese military officer uniforms, complete with white gloves, a mustache, and a samurai sword. They'll even argue with you. claiming that Japan's contributions to China during World War II outweighed the harm it caused. They go so far as to wish Japan had completely taken over China. To truly understand Chinese people's attitude toward Japan, you really have to explore the 1,000 plus years of interaction between the two countries. Don't be overwhelmed by the thought of a millennium. It's important to note that despite their geographic proximity, China and Japan haven't interacted all that frequently. It's not like Britain and France, who managed to fight wars for 100 years straight. I'll focus only on the most significant events. In the 7th century, Japan's civilization was still underdeveloped, while China was at the height of its glory during the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty is an era that Chinese people take immense pride in. Many in the West likely know of it as well. It represents the peak of ancient Chinese civilization, much like the Roman Empire for Italy or the Elizabethan era for England. At that time, Japan sent numerous envoys and students to China to study its culture and systems, adopting practices ranging from architecture and clothing to religion and cultural customs. This period of emulation laid the foundation for Japan's traditional culture, a fact that even the Japanese openly acknowledge. Apart from this, from the Tang Dynasty up until World War II, a span of over 1,000 years, at least 2 major events profoundly shaped Chinese attitudes toward Japan. Let's start with the first one. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Chinese emperors aiming to maintain stability in their rule began implementing a policy of isolationism, essentially banning free trade with other nations. At first, Japan was one of the few exceptions allowed to continue trading with China, but this trade was strictly regulated under the system of tribute trade. However, this restrictive model of trade couldn't meet Japan's growing commercial demands. In the early 16th century, 2 trade delegations from different Japanese domains clashed violently in Ningbo, China, competing for trading opportunities. The conflict escalated and spread throughout the city. After this incident, China completely prohibited trade with Japan. At that time, Japan was in a period of fragmentation, with various feudal domains, daimyos, fighting for resources to fuel their wars. Additionally, Japan had limited arable land but a large population, making the need for external resources even more pressing. Since normal trade channels were blocked by China, the Japanese turned to armed plundering to fulfill their needs. As a result, a large number of Japanese samurai appeared along China's southeastern coastal regions. These armed groups attacked Chinese villages and cities, plundering food, wealth, and even establishing numerous military bases along the coast. At the same time, due to the government's ban on overseas trade, many people in the coastal regions of China began to engage in smuggling, and some even developed into large-scale pirate organizations. These individuals often disguised themselves as Japanese or collaborated with Japanese samurai to carry out banditry. This caused the southeastern coastal regions of China to fall into prolonged chaos. It wasn't until trade was reopened that the situation began to be resolved. These Japanese samurai were referred to by the Chinese as woko, a term with a derogatory meaning. If we break it down, wo is an adjective used to describe something small or short, and ko is a noun meaning thief or bandit. This shows that from this time onward, the image of the Japanese in the eyes of the Chinese people was already quite negative. Even during World War II, the Chinese continued to use the term woko to refer to the Japanese. Now, let's talk about the second significant event. Many Westerners may not know that China and Japan had already fought a war before World War II. In the late 19th century, both China and Japan began learning from the West. However, Japan adapted much more quickly, rapidly strengthening its power and beginning to expand outward. After successfully establishing control over the Korean Peninsula, Japan naturally turned its attention toward China. In 1894, China and Japan erupted into a large-scale naval battle. Before this, the two countries had fought twice. The first encounter occurred in the mid-7th century when Japan invaded Korea but was defeated by the Tang Dynasty's army. This defeat made Japan realize the disparity between itself and the Tang Dynasty, prompting Japan to begin a comprehensive study of Chinese culture and institutions. More than 900 years later, in the late 16th century, Japan invaded the Korean Peninsula once again, and the Ming Dynasty sent troops to aid Korea, resulting in another defeat for Japan. Another 300 years later, in 1894, the two countries fought for the third time, and this battle was a decisive one. Despite China's navy being better equipped, Japan managed to defeat China, achieving a long-awaited victory. Japan forced China to pay 200 million taels of silver in reparations and took control of Taiwan, which was ceded to Japan. From that point on, Japan colonized Taiwan for half a century until Japan's defeat and surrender in 1945. This war once again changed the way Chinese people viewed Japan. For over 1,000 years prior to this, Japan was never seen as a powerful or advanced civilization by the Chinese. The Japanese were viewed as barbaric and backward, much like the other ethnic groups on the fringes of Chinese territories. However, the situation was different now. Suddenly, Japan had become very strong, and the Chinese were now in a position where they had to learn from Japan. This was a difficult adjustment for many Chinese people at the time. If the conflicts and wars between China and Japan had ended there, without the invasion and harm inflicted by Japan during World War II, Sino-Japanese relations would likely be much more harmonious today. This is what is referred to as the burden of history. On September 18, 1931, Japan began its invasion of China, quickly occupying the northeastern regions of China. On July 7, 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, a war that lasted until Japan's surrender in 1945. During these 14 years, Japan committed numerous massacres and atrocities in China, among the most well-known being the Nanjing Massacre, the Unit 731 experiments on Chinese people, and the Comfort Women system. These painful memories were written into history textbooks, and every generation of Chinese grows up learning about this history. It is clear that such a traumatic past cannot help but influence the attitude of the Chinese people toward Japan. In recent years, the government has designated December 13th as National Memorial Day to commemorate those who died in the Nanjing Massacre. The central government holds large-scale memorial activities in Nanjing every year, emphasizing that forgetting history is treason. On September 18th, air raid sirens are sounded in all cities in China to remind people not to forget the national humiliation. This period of history has deeply influenced the Chinese attitude toward Japan, especially among older generations who generally harbor strong resentment towards Japan. However, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, younger people have a different perspective on Japan. On one hand, many people believe that harboring hatred for today's Japanese people because of events that happened decades ago is unreasonable. It's like how one cannot be blamed today for the actions of their ancestors, such as slave trading. On the other hand, Japan's cultural exports to China, especially after the 1990s, had a huge influence on the younger generation. After World War II, Japan quickly recovered and became the second largest economic power in the world, right after the United States. This achievement earned Japan a great deal of respect from the Chinese. I remember when I was in middle school, our teachers often said that the Japanese Yamato people were one of the three most outstanding ethnic groups in the world. The other two, the Germanic people and the Jewish people. For many Chinese people born in the 1970s and 1980s, the Japanese people possess many admirable qualities. They are intelligent and hardworking, which has contributed to Japan's rapid rise. They are humble and very polite. Their cities are clean and orderly, and the quality of the products they manufacture is excellent. The only downside is that their government has consistently failed to properly address and deal with the historical issues related to World War II. At the same time, Japanese anime and video game culture have had a profound impact on several generations of Chinese people. From Hayao Miyazaki to Satoshi Kon, from Doraemon to Dragon Ball and One Piece, these are childhood memories for many generations of Chinese. As a result, many young people have become deeply interested in Japanese culture, and learning Japanese became a trend. I remember when I was in middle school, my classmates and I bought books to self-study Japanese, and some even said they wanted to have a Japanese-style wedding in the future. It could be said that before 2010, many young Chinese people held Japan in high regard and admiration. During that era, Japan was seen as an excellent, even perfect country from almost every perspective, worthy of praise and emulation by China. Although by this time, Japan had already lost 20 years, it was still far more developed and advanced than China at that time, an existence that China could not even remotely match. But things quickly changed. Another decade passed, and Japan's economy continued to stagnate, transforming the lost 20 years into the lost 30 years, with signs that it might soon enter the lost 40 years. Meanwhile, China was advancing rapidly. Chinese people began to realize that the praise for Japan during those years had become utterly ridiculous. After removing the filter, the reality was, 1. Japan is not an independent and autonomous country and has no ability to fully control its own destiny. 2. Japanese society still retains many characteristics of a feudal system, including male dominance and rigid class structures. Even its electoral system resembles the feudal era, where lords control their own territories, passing power from father to son. 3. Japanese companies operate on a seniority-based system, stifling many talented individuals and depriving them of opportunities to showcase their abilities. The society also lacks an environment conducive to innovation, which is why Japan missed the rise of the internet economy. Moreover, corporate leaders often lack accountability. Their response to problems typically involves simply bowing in apology without taking real responsibility. This same mindset likely influenced their decision to discharge nuclear wastewater into the ocean. 4. Due to agricultural protection policies, the standard of living in Japan doesn't seem particularly high, though it's still better than in South Korea. Haha! The idea that Japanese people can't afford to buy fruit has become a widely circulated claim on Chinese social media, and many people genuinely believe it. Chinese people's praise for Japan has gradually turned into mockery and even ridicule. Many summarize it this way: Japan has everything except hope, while China is the exact opposite. At the same time, the Japanese government consistently views China as a hypothetical enemy and is one of the most active countries internationally in opposing China. This has led to China's official stance toward Japan remaining negative. The combination of these factors has caused Japan's image in the minds of Chinese people to decline rapidly. However, since 2022, the situation has changed again. Over the past 2 years, due to China's challenging economic situation, finding a job has become exceptionally difficult for many young people, and the phenomenon of involution has become increasingly severe. China graduates over 12 million university students each year, but the number of new job opportunities is alarmingly scarce. This has turned the job market into a complete buyer's market, where employers hold the upper hand. The prevailing sentiment is, if you don't want to take this job, there are plenty of others who do. Then, young people in China were surprised to discover that the situation for Japanese university graduates was completely different. Due to decades of declining birth rates in Japan, fresh graduates face no trouble finding employment. In fact, scenarios like, if you don't want this job, there's literally no one else to take it, have surprisingly become a reality in Japan, with employers actively competing to attract candidates. In China, this kind of situation only exists in humorous videos on platforms like TikTok. However, with the country's rapidly declining birth rate in recent years, many people are speculating that in 20 years, China might face a similar scenario as Japan does today. At the same time, Chinese young people have noticed that the previously rumored claims about Japan's intense work culture turned out to be exaggerated. Compared to the grueling work intensity in Chinese companies, Japanese employers now appear to be relatively considerate and humane. As a result, many have unknowingly rekindled their interest in Japanese language learning, digging out old tutorial videos that had been left untouched for years. After several shifts in perspective, more and more people are developing an objective view of Japan. Japan has its strengths and its flaws. While we will never forget the harm Japan inflicted on us in history, it doesn't mean we harbor dislike toward Japanese people in the present day. Perhaps there will still be conflicts between China and Japan in the future, much like the Diaoyu Islands territorial dispute from years past. However, more and more Chinese people are learning to view their neighbor with a rational and balanced perspective.